So our gospel reading for today comes from Matthew chapter 16, verses 21 through 28. Let us listen now for the word of God. From that time, Jesus began to show his disciples that he had to go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the elders, chief priests, and legal experts, and that he had to be killed and raised on the third day. Then Peter took hold of Jesus and, scolding him, began to correct him. "God forbid, Lord, this won't happen to you." But Jesus turned to Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan. You are a stone that could make me stumble, for you are not thinking God's thoughts, but human thoughts." Then Jesus said to his disciples, "All who want to come after me must say no to themselves, pick up their cross, and follow me. All who want to save their lives will lose them, but all who lose their lives because of me will find them. Why would people gain the whole world but lose their lives? What will people give in exchange for their lives? For the human one is about to come with the majesty of his Father with his angels, and then he will repay each one for what that person has done. And I assure you that some standing here won't die before they see the human one coming in his kingdom." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. If we think about it, we know the deep wisdom of saying that those who try to save their lives will lose them. Think of that classic character, Mr. Scrooge from Charles Dickens' Christmas Carol. Mr. Scrooge hoarded wealth but had no love. Think of people who have everything they could ever want but still want more. Think of us who cling to old ideas and find ourselves living in fear of the people and the world around us. Deep down, we know that fear robs us of life and that we lose something in our attempt to save our lives. There is the way of the world, and then there is the way of God. We are reminded of that today in this scripture, where Jesus says, "Take up your cross and follow me." God's ways are not our ways, God's thoughts not our thoughts. As Paul says, the message of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing. God's logic, God's ways don't make sense according to our logic. And that, I think, is what Peter is responding to today. Jesus begins to tell the disciples that he must suffer and die. This, by the way, is the first time that he says this in the Gospel of Matthew. And this part in Matthew, from that time on, as it says, is a turning point from all that comes before. Jesus is turned now squarely to Jerusalem, to the suffering and death that await him. And he tells them this, but Peter says, "No, Lord, this won't happen to you." He is astounded and offended and uncomfortable, so much that he claims the right to scold Jesus. And this is the same Peter who just a few chapters before, not even chapters, verses, the section right before this, Jesus said, "Who do you say that I am?" And Peter said, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." Jesus says, "You are the rock on which I will build my church." But just a few verses later, here we are with Peter not really comfortable with what it will mean to be the Messiah. And Jesus rebuking him, saying, "You are a stone that could make me stumble. Get behind me, Satan," he says. It echoes the temptations from Satan that Jesus knew in Matthew chapter 4. Peter here has gone from a rock on which the church will be built to a stumbling block in short order. And we may think, "Peter, why are you so silly?" But we, after all these years, are comfortable with our crucified Christ. We know the end of the story. We know that is coming. Peter, though, doesn't. Peter and the other disciples, well, I think that they were expecting a Messiah full of power and victory who would make things right. But what they get and what they hear from Jesus himself right in here is that that's not how it's going to be. That God's logic, God's ways, God's wisdom is the opposite of our wisdom. It is not about taking power, but losing power. Not about holding on, but about giving life away. Jesus tells them that this is how it's going to be, that this is inevitable in a way, because Jesus opposed the powerful. He opposed that logic of power and control that is so often the logic of our human life, then and now. Jesus opposed the oppression of the Roman Empire. And so to follow that path to its natural consequence, the systems of power will fight back, and they did. And Peter doesn't like it. He's uncomfortable with this kind of Messiah. It's unthinkable. And truth be told, we don't often like it either. We may be used to it, but if we were to probe our hearts, we don't really want suffering. We want the easy way. We are often tempted, even if we think that we're not, by the prizes that our culture offers, by security and achievement, by money and status. We live sometimes and oftentimes in that shallow water. We want to avoid pain and suffering and would rather have that powerful Messiah. There's something embarrassing and kind of cringeworthy in a way about a weak and a trembling God who gives it all up. So why is this good news? Why would we follow Jesus if it's going to be difficult? What about this makes following Jesus something worth doing? If it's going to put us at odds with our culture, our families, and even maybe our long-held, cherished beliefs. What is good about losing our lives? How are our lives saved when they are lost? In C.S. Lewis's classic novel, got it here, The Chronicles of Narnia, which, if you don't know, C.S. Lewis was a theologian and a writer, and the Narnia novels offer a lot of allegories to our Christian life. But in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, we hear the story of children who go to this magical world of Narnia, where there is a good king, Aslan, the lion. And to put a long story short, in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, the second novel, the kids get into trouble with the witch who also lives there, who represents that other way, the way of evil and destruction and power and control. And so in the course of things, Aslan finds himself giving up his life for the sake of the children, with the witch and the other creatures who work for her taunting him and torturing him. And he does all this, presumably the deal that they have is to appease what they call the deep magic. The magic that requires that blood be shed for a traitor. But the children, after Aslan is dead, come and find that he is alive. And they don't know what to make of it. And they say, "What does it mean?" And Aslan says, "It means that though the witch knew the deep magic, there is a magic deeper still which she did not know. Her knowledge goes back only to the dawn of time. But if she could have looked a little further back into the stillness and darkness before time dawned, she would have read there a different incantation. She would have known that when a willing victim who had committed no treachery was killed in a traitor's stead, the table of sacrifice would crack and death itself would start working backwards. There is a deeper magic," Aslan says, "and it is a magic of love poured out for the other." And that sign reminds me that God offers life that is more abundant, deeper and richer than the lives that we cling to and chase. God's way is that deeper magic, that which is realer than real, truer than true, at the very heart of existence. I think our Guatemala Living Waters for the World participants and travelers would tell you of that deeper life, that any ounce of sacrifice, of discomfort with travel, all of that is transformed by the power of worshiping together and building partnerships and love, pure love for each other, for the team, and for those they partner with. Those who've learned about creation care and the need for racial justice might also tell you that there can be a great deal of discomfort in that, but there's also shimmering out there on the horizon a deeper truth, a greater love. Anyone who has sought after God's calling on their life or made a difficult act of forgiveness, anyone who has courageously cared for another, even when friendship or family did not require it. These people, all of you, many of you know, you have experienced it, that there is a deeper magic, God's way, that is quietly running under and upholding our lives if we seek after it. Now, sometimes that other way doesn't feel great. I think about now when we've been wearing masks and worshiping online. It doesn't always seem like the greatest reward for us, but we do these things for the deeper truth, which is to care for one another, to care for our neighbor, to care for the world. The deeper magic is a life that is poured out for others. Writer and teacher Barbara Brown Taylor writes, "The deep secret of Jesus's words in this passage is that our fear of suffering and death robs us of life. because fear of death always turns into fear of life, into a stingy, cautious way of living that is not really living at all. The deep secret of Jesus's hard words is that the way to have abundant life is not to save it, but to spend it, to give it away, because life cannot be shut up and saved any more than a bird can be put in a shoebox and stored on a closet shelf. Following Jesus requires us, calls us to that kind of life. And there will be discomfort and pain. That is the nature of life. We cannot avoid suffering. And if we are to follow Christ into the way of deep love for all of God's creatures and people, we know that the systems of power will fight back. But in our suffering, in the pain that comes no matter what we do, we also know and are filled with that deep, deep love of the alternative path that Jesus offers. Don't we want to know that there is real good that comes out of even our small, eager efforts to follow? Like that monarch in our pollinator garden, there is real good. And so we follow Jesus because we believe that the way of pouring ourselves out is the way to truth and to life, to real self-sacrificing love that is active in the world, that is that deeper magic. So in these difficult days, do not be afraid. Do not cling to the promises of this world, but look for the deeper way of God's love and live into it. As Paul says later in the epistles, take hold of that which really is life. Life for all, life for you and for me.